Good day and welcome to the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouses, the Role of Child Care Subsidies in the Lives of Low-Income Children webinar. Today's program is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Kristen Moore, SSRC Executive Committee Member and Senior Scholar at Child Trends. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, and hello everyone, and welcome to our 15th Emerging Scholar webinar with Anna Johnson as our Emerging Scholar and Gail Hamilton as discussant. I am Chris Moore, your moderator. First, a brief overview of the SSRC. The Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse is a virtual portal of research and other resources related to self-sufficiency. It functions as an online community for researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders interested in self-sufficiency, employment, and family and child well-being. The purpose of the SSRC is to disseminate quality research, and we currently have over 5,400 items in the library. On the left of this slide is a snapshot of the filters in the library. As you can see, you may filter through the collection by reference type, topical area, research methodology, and popular search terms, among others. We've filtered research methodology to pull up a record of a thesis written by our current emerging scholar and today's speaker, Anna Johnson. This is shown on the upper left. On the far right are the 12 topical areas for the SSRC. Every topic area page under the Browse Topics tab includes our Library Recommends box that highlights research and resources recommended by the SSRC Library. Each topical area page also includes relevant federal laws and regulations. Turning to the selection criteria, emerging scholars are graduate students or a degree recipient with no more than 10 years of experience, someone who's currently doing research on self-sufficiency issues and conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses a self-sufficiency issue that needs greater attention. They can be working in any of a variety of settings, academic, programs, think tanks, or an agency setting. This list of previous emerging scholars illustrates the variety of topics that have been covered, ranging from family structure to health insurance, to chronic and transient poverty, to assets, maternal incarceration, and the use of administrative data. And today's speaker is Anna Johnson, who has a PhD and is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University. Our discussant is Gail Hamilton, who is a senior fellow at MDRC, and I am Chris Moore, senior scholar at Child Trends. Please submit questions anytime through the question and answer feature, which is at the bottom right of your screen, and we'll answer questions after the presentation, or if we run out of time, we'll post responses on the SSRC with other webinar materials after the event. And finally, we encourage you to join today's conversation on Twitter using the SSRC webinar hashtag displayed on the screen. Tweets using this hashtag will display on the left side of the webinar platform. Now, we'll turn to Dr. Anna Johnson.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for that wonderful introduction to the SSRC more broadly, as well as a little bit about my slice of self-sufficiency research. What I'll be talking about today is the role of child care subsidies in the lives of low-income children. And I'll start by saying that early care and education, or ECE programs, are what families access using child care subsidies, what I'll spend most of today talking about, which is a key component of self-sufficiency because when parents are employed, they need a place, a safe, nurturing place to put their children while they're working, and child care subsidies afford access to early care and education, or ECE settings. What are these ECE settings and how do we think about them? I'll start with a quick historical overview of the early care component of that and the early education component of that. So when I say child care, historically that meant care typically provided to the children of low-income parents to support parental employment, in other words, a place for children to go while parents worked. these could be thought of more typically as kind of daycare settings. At the same time, historically, early education programs developed as supplementary education settings really designed to augment or enhance the early development of children of higher income parents who didn't necessarily need to work. But in 2016, these two streams of early care and early education have really combined, and there's a great deal of overlap. It's hard to find an early child care setting that cares for children while parents work that doesn't provide some type of educational stimulation, developmentally appropriate materials, a curriculum, and qualified teachers or caregivers. At the same time, an early education setting like a pre-K in a public school, for instance, that may be designated as primarily educational and as a supplementary educational setting for children, it's hard to find a setting like that in 2016 that doesn't serve a mix of children of working parents from all income backgrounds as well as children of parents who don't work. So early care and education, both the child care and the education part in 2016 occur in a variety of settings. You can have center-based care, which is care provided in a center or a school, and these would include the kind of public pre-K as well as daycare settings I mentioned earlier, nursery schools, child care centers, preschools, et cetera. Home-based care is another setting for ECE, and this includes care provided in the caregiver or the child's home. It can be provided by a licensed provider or an unlicensed or informal caregiver who might be a family member, a neighbor, a friend, or a nanny or a babysitter. Center-based ECE, there's a lot of research to suggest, is generally more promoting of school readiness, particularly for children in the year before they enter kindergarten, because it's typically higher in quality. And by quality, I mean it has many of the features known to support early development, like small group sizes, an empirically supported curriculum, materials known to stimulate early learning, and trained teachers with experience educating young children. So in general, center-based ECE has more of those high-quality features, at least for preschool-age children on the cusp of entering kindergarten, than do those home-based ECE settings. The subcategory of ECE programs, both center and home-based, on which I focus are those that are publicly funded. And there are three public mainstreams of public funding for ECE programs in the United States. Those include the Head Start program, the public pre-K program, and the Child Care Subsidy program. The Head Start program is probably the most well-known. It's the oldest ECE program, begun in 1965 as part of President Johnson's War on Poverty. It is almost exclusively center-based, although home-based settings can receive Head Start funding. And Head Start is subject to federal regulations that hold it to a relatively high standard. For instance, teachers have to have a certain level of training, and group sizes and ratios of teachers to children in classrooms must be adhered to. Notably, the Head Start program is targeted to low-income children. So in order to enroll in a Head Start program, you need to be 100% of the federal poverty line, living in a household with an income 100% of the federal poverty line or lower. And Head Start is a program aimed at 3- and 4-year-old children. The public pre-K program is also aimed at 3- and 4-year-old children. It's newer than the Head Start program. Recent state and local expansions of pre-K have occurred in the last 15 years. With more than 40 states currently having some type of public pre-K program. These programs are also mostly center-based, typically offered through the public schools, but can also be provided through community-based centers and more rarely through home-based settings, but almost always it's a center-based program. Like Head Start, some public pre-K programs are targeted to low-income families, but there are also universal pre-K programs throughout the country that serve children from families with higher socioeconomic backgrounds than being low-income. The third and final public stream for early care and education programs in the United States is the one on which I'll focus today, which is the Child Care Subsidy program. This has been the primary focus of my own research program and what I'm going to spend the most time talking about today. So child care subsidies, unlike Head Start and public pre-K, which were really designed to provide preschool education to children as they prepare to enter kindergarten. Child care subsidies were designed primarily to support parental employment. They were initiated as part of the welfare reform legislation of 1996. They are mostly provided to parents via vouchers, which allow parents to use the child care subsidy to purchase care in a setting that helps, that suits their scheduling needs given their employment status. Importantly, subsidy eligibility is conditioned on parental income and employment status. So unlike Head Start, where you just need to be poor to access the program, or pre-K, where there may be an income requirement or there may not be, to access child care subsidies, the family needs to demonstrate both income and employment eligibility. That is, they need to be both low income, and those levels vary depending on the state in which the family lives, and they also need to be employed. And this is where we can really link to self-sufficiency, because if we think about the child care in general as being a program that supports parental employment by providing a place for children to go while parents work, child care subsidies help offset the cost of care so that low-income parents transitioning off of welfare or who are low-income and trying to stay off of welfare can find secure employment and maintain employment with the assistance of a child care subsidy that lowers the cost of child care they need so that they can go to work. So if we kind of think about child care subsidies as the third piece of that pie, where Head Start and public pre-K are the other two pieces, we note that subsidies are different in that they are not primarily focused on child development, but more focused on supporting parental employment and parents' economic self-sufficiency. As a result, the subsidy program has to be highly flexible. Parents have to be able to use their subsidy to purchase early care and education with a provider that will help them meet their work requirements, whatever those may be. So some parents may work odd hours, split shifts, multiple jobs, et cetera, and they need a child care setting that will meet those employment scheduling needs. So subsidies can be used to purchase care in a community-based center, which is a non-Head Start, non-pre-K center, or they can be used to purchase care in a family child care home that could be licensed or unlicensed, or to reimburse a family member, a friend, or a neighbor for providing care for the child. So there's a lot of flexibility that comes with using a child care subsidy, which means there's also a lot of variation in the kinds of care that subsidies can buy. The CCDF, which is the Child Care Development Fund, or the federal funding stream that funds the subsidy program, serves a substantial portion of low-income children who are receiving publicly funded ECE. So it serves about 1.5 million children relative to 1.3 million children served by public pre-K and just under 1 million children served by Head Start. The subsidy program also costs more than these other programs. For instance, in 2013, more than $8 billion were spent on subsidies, which can be compared to about $7 billion, $7.5 billion spent on Head Start, and $5 billion spent on public pre-K. So it's a very expensive program that serves more children and costs more than either of those other two programs. And as I mentioned earlier, the income cutoff for child care subsidy eligibility does depend on the state in which you live in. So if we think about this tremendous public expense of the child care subsidy program, how many children it serves and how much it costs taxpayers to provide, it's surprising when we think about how little research has actually been done on the program itself and on attempting to understand how it affects child development. So there is evidence that the subsidy program supports parental employment, but we know much less about what it does for children. So the primary question I have focused on in my research and that I'll talk about now is this kind of broad question of, do child care subsidies support the development of low-income children? And theoretically, if we think about how subsidies might do that, there are a couple different ways. One is directly by impacting children's skills, helping to prepare them for kindergarten. And the other is indirectly by increasing access to the kinds of ECE that promotes development. So to understand the role of child care subsidies in the lives of low-income children, we have to ask three questions. Essentially, do subsidies impact the type of ECE children experience, so center versus home-based settings? Do subsidies impact the quality of ECE that children experience? And then third, do subsidies directly impact children's developmental outcomes? In other words, does it somehow affect their cognitive and social readiness for kindergarten? And in my research, I've addressed all three of those questions, typically using secondary data analytic methods of large national data sets. For these questions, I've mostly used the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Birth Cohort, which is also referred to as the ECLSB, which is a nationally representative study of children born in the United States in 2001. It's a very rich data set that collected information at 4 different time points on parents via parent interviews. It directly assessed children's cognitive and social development and interviewed their child care providers as well as their kindergarten teachers. And data were collected when children were born, when they were infants, in 2001, in 2003 when they were 2 years old, in 2005, 2006 when they were in preschool, and in 2006, 2007 when they were in kindergarten. For my work, I've mostly limited my sample to low-income, subsidy-eligible families, mostly because comparing the ECE choices or developmental outcomes of children who are eligible for subsidies, which, as I said earlier, is conditioned on income and employment requirements, comparing those children to children of parents who aren't low-income or who don't work could yield very different results that would be spurious or would be the result of those sample differences and not a result of the subsidy program per se. So we call this a selection bias. So to kind of limit that selection bias, I've limited my samples to the subsample of ECLSB participants who are low-income and subsidy eligible. And to further kind of isolate the association between subsidies and child care choices or children's outcomes, I have used, typically regression models, linear and nonlinear regression models with extensive covariates to try to account for these pre-existing differences between families who use subsidies and families who don't, so that doesn't bias estimates between subsidy use and children's outcomes. I've also used some more sophisticated quantitative modeling techniques like propensity score matching, which is a quasi-experimental method also designed to reduce selection bias. So I'll highlight some of what I found with respect to those 3 questions I mentioned earlier. The first question being, do subsidies impact the type of ECE that children experience? And I've pursued this question 2 different ways. First, by asking about what subsidy use does in the year before kindergarten to the child care choices that children make in the year before kindergarten, and also by asking a more longitudinal question about whether subsidy use at an earlier time point impacts the child care experiences of children in their preschool year before they enter kindergarten. So if we look here, this is kind of the universe of subsidized and unsubsidized ECE that I kind of alluded to earlier. These are subsidy-eligible families, so families who are low-income and meet employment requirements in the ECLSB in their child's preschool year, that 2005-2006 data wave. And here you see that about 28% of these families use subsidies, and the remaining 3 quadrants here are split into those using Head Start, those using public pre-K, which are other publicly funded options, and then the purple slice, which is unsubsidized care. And going forward, when we think about comparison for subsidy recipients, I'll be focusing on these different pieces of the pie and calling out specific comparisons. So subsidy recipients, that blue slice, compared to those in other publicly funded care, which would be those in the red and green slices of Head Start and public pre-K, as well as comparing subsidy recipients to those in fully unsubsidized care, the purple slice. And those are families who are either privately paying for care or who are getting free care through some other mechanism, maybe free care through a church or synagogue, through a YMCA in the neighborhood, or some other community program. So when we ask this question of whether subsidy receipt increases or changes the child care setting that children experience, what I found is that, yes, subsidy recipients are more likely to use center-based care than are non-recipients of subsidies in unsubsidized settings. So remember that the red Head Start slice and the green pre-K slice are mostly center-based settings, so it doesn't make sense to ask whether subsidy use changes the setting that those folks experience. First of all, those aren't subsidies, and second of all, those are mostly center-based settings. So really we're looking at the comparison of subsidy recipients where subsidies can be used in centers or homes to unsubsidized care recipients where they can be in unsubsidized centers or unsubsidized homes. And what we see here is that among those two slices of the pie, those receiving subsidies are much more likely to use a center, 60%, compared to those not receiving subsidies. Only 30% of those families used center-based ECE settings. So that kind of answers that first part of the question. In the preschool year, among children in those non-Head Start and non-pre-K settings, subsidies seem to increase the use of center-based ECE. And at this time in the preschool year, the only publicly funded alternative to subsidies are these Head Start and public pre-K settings. But if you back up a little bit and look at 2-year-old children, Head Start and public pre-K are not available to children at that age. They are preschool programs that are available to 3- and 4-year-old children. So what happens at age 2 if you offer a subsidy to a family? What are they going to do? Their alternative does not include the red and green slices of Head Start and public pre-K. So that's the next question that I asked. Wondering whether subsidy received at an earlier time point before Head Start and public pre-K are available increases the use of center-based ECE, which may be subsequently in the preschool year when Head Start and pre-K become available, increases selection into those programs, which, as we know, are designed to support child development and therefore may be more positive for low-income children. And what I found when I asked that question is indeed that when you look at subsidy receipts at age 2, and you look at where those children end up when they're in their preschool year, subsidy receipt does increase the likelihood that a family will select Head Start or public pre-K and other publicly funded settings in the preschool year when they have those options available. So what you see there is the kind of green bar for center-based care along the horizontal axis there, that the difference between a subsidized versus not receiving a subsidy at age 2 versus not receiving a subsidy at age 2 greatly increases the probability of selecting into other publicly funded care that would be Head Start or public pre-K in the preschool year. Whereas if you use your subsidy in a home-based setting, home-based non-parental care, the middle set of bars there was no difference in whether you were going to attend a publicly funded setting in your preschool year, Head Start or public pre-K. So another way of saying that is that using a subsidy at age 2 increases the likelihood of using Head Start or public pre-K in the preschool year, particularly if that subsidy at age 2 was used in a center-based setting. Whereas not using a subsidy at age 2 or using a subsidy in a home-based setting did not increase the likelihood of using Head Start or public pre-K in the preschool year when those options became available. So to summarize that kind of line of inquiry, in the preschool year, subsidies do lead families to purchase center-based ECE that may otherwise be unaffordable to them. And in the toddler years, when children are 2 years old, when subsidies are the only public ECE option, subsidy use seems to begin a pattern of center-based ECE use that continues into the preschool years, subsequently leading to increased likelihood to use something like Head Start or public pre-K, these other publicly funded center-based ECE options. The next question that I pursued asked whether subsidies impact the quality of ECE that low-income children experience. And this question, I used observational data of the quality of children's ECE experiences using a widely used observational instrument of children's early care and education environment called the ECHRS, or the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale. It ranges from 1 to 7, where 1 indicates very low quality care, care that doesn't have materials, activities, and interactions known to support early development. And a 7 on that 1 to 7 scale indicates very high quality care, or care that does have those developmentally important features. And what I did to assess this association between subsidies and child care quality is focus on this subsidy eligible sample and compare subsidy recipients to all eligible non-recipients, or those other slices of the pie, the Head Start, pre-K, and unsubsidized care folks all considered together. And when you do that, what you see is that subsidy recipients experience lower quality care on that 1 to 7 quality scale. So they experience care that's about a half a point lower than all eligible non-recipients of subsidies considered together. But when you break out those pieces of the pie according to the setting that those children do experience, what you see is that subsidy recipients compared to Head Start recipients experience care that's almost a full point lower on that 7-point quality scale. And likewise, versus pre-K, subsidy recipients experience care that's almost a full point lower in quality than public pre-K. Not surprising, given that those two settings were designed specifically to support children's early learning. But when you compare subsidy recipients to that slice of the pie that represents unsubsidized care, that purple slice of the pie, you see that subsidy recipients get care that is about a half point higher in quality than children in unsubsidized care. So to summarize that, what we find is that compared to these unsubsidized settings, those that are not Head Start or pre-K or subsidies, subsidies purchase care that's higher in quality. But when you compare subsidy recipients to those in Head Start and public pre-K, the care that subsidy recipients experience is lower in quality on average. And finally, what do we know about the direct effect of subsidies on children's developmental outcomes, their cognitive and social school readiness for kindergarten? Here, I looked at whether subsidy recipients in a subsidy-eligible sample had higher, lower, or no different reading, math, and behavior scores than subsidy-eligible families who did not use subsidies. And you can see here these are essentially zero coefficients. They are not statistically significant, and they are very close to zero. So there is no association between receiving a subsidy in the year before kindergarten and your kindergarten reading, math, or behavior scores. So to summarize that finding, and I found this using a variety of different statistical methods, that in general, subsidies do not promote children's kindergarten readiness. They are on average unrelated, or in some other studies, which I can talk about later, conducted by other scholars, very weakly negatively related to children's kindergarten school readiness outcomes. So this really puts us in kind of a bit of a quandary, which is if subsidies increase the use of center-based ECE, which I told you in the beginning is higher in quality and more promoting of child development, and if subsidies increase the use of high-quality ECE, which should be more promoting of development, why don't subsidies themselves enhance children's developmental outcomes? One possibility is that there is variation by demographic subgroups, that maybe subsidies are not neutral for everyone, but that there's some subgroups for whom subsidies are very positive. And there's some preliminary research that I've conducted that suggests that, for instance, among low-income children of immigrants, subsidies can support reading development when they're used in certain settings. It's also possible that some subsidized settings support certain developmental outcomes more than others. So in some cases, we find that some subsidized settings, rather, are more supportive of school readiness skills if the subsidy is used in a center-based setting. So if we compare subsidy recipients to unsubsidized individuals in centers, those unsubsidized individuals, children in unsubsidized centers, seem to have better outcomes, whereas comparing subsidy recipients to those in home-based care, subsidy recipients then seem to do better themselves. But this, as I just alluded to, varies by the outcome. So there seems to be some suggestive evidence that subsidy recipients do better on math outcomes relative to those in home-based settings, subsidy recipients in centers, that is, whereas unsubsidized children in unsubsidized centers seem to have even better math outcomes than children with subsidies in centers. So there's variation both by where the subsidy is used, that is, subsidized centers may be better than subsidized homes, but unsubsidized centers may be better than all of those things. And there's some variation by the outcome, that is, some children in subsidized settings seem to exhibit worse math skills, for instance, than children in unsubsidized center-based settings, at least. So in future research, there's definitely need to understand what explains these mixed results. And I think the best way to do that might be, or at least a starting point, to understand what classroom and teacher characteristics might give rise to these differences for different children in different settings and on different outcomes. And this is just kind of a conceptual model of where I think my own research is going in the future to try to understand why subsidies lead to higher quality care and center-based care, but not better outcomes. For whom do they lead for better outcomes, and when? We might need to understand how the teacher qualifications, for instance, teacher job satisfaction, and the curricula in the classrooms and the materials in the classrooms might vary depending on where the subsidy is used, a center or a home, and depending on who experiences those different settings. For instance, children of low-income immigrants, children who are dual language learners, and children with special needs. So the implications of this research, I think, are primarily a better understanding of for whom and under what circumstances subsidies support early development would help the federal government advise states on how to invest their funds that are earmarked for quality improvement of programs that receive subsidies. Without knowing which programs are most promoting and supportive of child development, it's hard to know where we should invest funds to improve quality across these programs. And for research implications, I think some of this research really highlights the importance of the comparison group. So subsidy recipients get higher quality care compared to non-recipients in unsubsidized care, but not compared to Head Start and pre-K. So understanding who we're comparing subsidy recipients to is really important when we think about how to invest funds and where children are going to receive the most developmental support. And on that note, I will thank you for your time and look forward to your questions and a lively discussion.
Thank you very much, Anna. Everyone, please submit questions at any time through the question and answer feature in the bottom right of the screen. And at this point, we will turn to Gail Hamilton, Senior Fellow at MDRC, for discussion.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Anna, for presenting some really thought-provoking research findings. My remarks, unsurprisingly, will reflect my research background at MDRC. And as many of you know, MDRC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan social policy research firm whose mission is to improve the lives of low-income individuals and families. So in the next couple minutes, I'll take advantage of some of MDRC's research to add a few more pieces to the puzzle that Anna is seeking to put together. And these puzzle pieces will be in two areas. First, I'll say a few things about how parents receiving child care and development fund subsidies choose child care. And then second, I'll remark about the importance of what one compares to in seeking to determine if CCDF subsidies make a difference in the quality of care. And just note that both of the studies I'll draw on were funded by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So first, let's take a look kind of under the hood of child care choice among subsidy recipients to see what might be driving parents' choices. MDRC just completed a study that helped the state of Indiana figure out if certain changes to its child care subsidy program would increase the use of high-quality child care providers. The bottom line from that study is that these changes actually did result in such an increase. But for the purpose of our discussion today, in the course of figuring out what changes should be tried in Indiana, MDRC learned a lot about why parents may not choose state-vetted child care providers or may not choose providers that are highly rated by the state. And there were several reasons for this. First, many parents did not know that the state actually vetted providers and rated them. Or if they did know this, they did not understand the rating system. Secondly, parents were under a big time pressure when they were moved off the state waiting list for vouchers. And about 12,000 people are on the waiting list in Indiana. And so when this happened, parents moved off the list. They had only a short time, a few weeks, to select a child care provider. Third thing we noticed was that in some cases, parents were already paying for child care, but because they were waiting to receive a child care subsidy voucher, they had settled for lower cost, lower quality care, And then when they moved off the waiting list, they did not want to disrupt their children's routine and change providers. So reflecting these different situations, overall in Indiana, more than a third of families who receive child care subsidies use providers that do not have the state's stamp of approval. And so these reasons, the reasons for this might help us understand some of the types of care that are included in the subsidy pie slices in the charts that were in Anna's presentation. So now just a few words about the importance of the counterfactual, or what we are comparing the effects of child care subsidies to. And this is something that Anna emphasized at the end of her presentation. So, as Anna mentioned early on, states are allowed to determine the maximum allowable income they will use to determine eligibility for child care subsidies. And in 2007, the cap in Illinois, another state we've worked with, was 50%. And this was an eligibility limit that at the time was low across all the states. So working with MDRC, Illinois decided to experiment with the effects of raising that cap. So for a one-year period, families with incomes between 50 and 65% of the state median income were randomly assigned as part of this study to either be eligible for child care subsidies or to continue to not be eligible for the subsidies. And then MDRC compared these two groups over time. Because of random assignment, the groups had very similar characteristics, except for the one group's new eligibility for the subsidies. And what we found was that the group eligible for the subsidies compared to the other group was more likely to use center-based child care, was less likely to use home-based child care, had more stable child care, and was more satisfied with their child care. And also reflecting the primary purpose of child care subsidies to support parents' employment, the group newly eligible for the subsidies compared to the randomly generated group not eligible for subsidies had fewer problems on their jobs that were related to child care issues. So I just want to emphasize, as Anna did in her presentation, that how we assess something depends a lot on what we're comparing it to. So with that, I will wrap up and just note that if anyone wants to learn more about the two studies that I mentioned, feel free to go to the MDRC website, mdrc.org, and search under child care subsidies. And you can also sign up there to receive emails when we have new findings on areas of interest to you. So thank you for listening, and so I'll ask Chris if she wants to pose some of the audience questions, or I could pose a question myself to Anna.
Okay, thank you very much, Gail. It was really interesting also. Do you want to respond at all, Anna? Otherwise, I do have some questions.
No, I mean, I've long admired and followed the work of MDRC, and it's certainly always reassuring when multiple studies come to similar conclusions, and their work on both finding that across different studies over several decades that subsidies both increase mothers' employment status, their likelihood to be employed, and also increase the use of center-based care. And as Gail said, some more qualitative data on how satisfied families are with the care they use, as well as more quantitative indicators of their use of more stable care and higher quality care, is all very reinforcing of the research findings that I presented today. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to have a very kind of synchronized conversation.
Perfect. Sure. An initial question: did you measure families who use more than one type of care? Since, for example, Head Start or pre-K may not cover all of the parents' hours of work.
Yeah, so that's tricky. When I shared the slide on the secondary data source that I've used most commonly for this research, it's the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Birth Cohort. And unfortunately, that survey, like many other similar surveys that exist, asked parents about the care they used for the most hours per week. So when I identified this, whether you're a subsidy recipient or a Head Start recipient or a pre-K recipient, it's really, I had to identify them as being mutually exclusive. So whatever you use for the most amount of time per week put you in that slice of the pie. But what we recognize in real life is that many of these families are, the same at different points in time. And may actually be multiple users of different programs at the same point in time. So you might have a family who uses child care subsidy to fund care for part of the week or part of the day while the child is not in public pre-K, and maybe they attend pre-K or Head Start in the morning if it's a half day or part day or part week program, for instance. So that is some important kind of background to understand when you're working with these kinds of survey data. So the short answer to the question is I was not able to assess families who belonged in multiple sections of that pie at the same time. I had to, identify them as being in one section of the pie only. But I think it would be wonderful if future research could kind of more comprehensively account for what families do in a given week or a given day, which is probably use multiple programs at once.
Okay, thank you. Here's a somewhat related question. When one receives a subsidy, are there certain vendors they can use provided by the state, or is it totally up to the parents?
So it's pretty much totally up to the parent, and that's why you see a lot of variability in both the type and quality of care that parents purchase with their subsidy. So there are state subsidy administration offices in different states and localities that, certainly encourage parents, offer them a list of, as Gail said, kind of state approved or, settings that have been subject to a quality rating system that the state provides. Certainly state child care subsidy offices can provide parents with those lists. But ultimately, a key tenet of the subsidy program is flexibility to support parental employment. So subsidy administrators are, discouraged, prohibited really in terms of the legislation from steering parents, towards a certain setting and not allowing them to use their subsidy in a setting of their choice. So assuming the provider is not a felon, doesn't have a felony record, the provider can be reimbursed essentially with a subsidy. So it can be a grandparent, a cousin, an aunt, a neighbor. It does not need to be a state-approved or licensed or regulated setting.
Okay, thank you. Turn back to Gail in a minute, but here's another one from the audience. I understand the necessity of child care subsidies for early childhood development. Given the statistical data and studies proving the connection of early learning, why is it so difficult for the existing programs to obtain the necessary funding to increase the number of low-income families to be served?
That is a question I think many, subsidy administrators and individuals who work in, job, welfare offices and departments of health and human services in cities and states around the country, as well as kind of, advocates for, supporting early learning among all children, not just low-income children, would love to have the answer to. So, there is a big disconnect, I think, between research and policy, which is something that many of us on the phone have been working probably for a long time to try to close that gap. But just because we have some kind of suggestive evidence in the research arena that, something may be more or less supportive of child development doesn't necessarily mean that the policies will reflect that. And by policies, I also mean kind of generosity of funding. So it is, like many federal and state programs, the CCDF subsidy program is underfunded. It doesn't have, as much funding as it probably needs in order to provide families with enough money in their voucher to purchase the best care for their kids. And I think that, there's also on the research side, we need to acknowledge that the research evidence isn't actually unequivocal. It isn't airtight. It doesn't say, oh yes, this program is definitely good for all children. What it says is, under certain circumstances for certain children, care purchased with a subsidy might, modestly support, reading development, for instance. But it's not. There's not enough evidence to argue to your, state legislators that we need to fund this program at a much higher rate, because it is going to solve all of our kind of early learning disparity problems. So I think there's a lot of, it's kind of an unsatisfying answer to your question, but it's something that I struggle with, and I hope that, that other researchers will continue to struggle with too, because I think that, we need a lot more research on the efficacy of the subsidy program before we can make a really strong case for increasing its funding.
One might note that it does not cause harm, but it doesn't seem to have clear positive outcomes.
Exactly.
I wanted to turn back to Gail for comment or question.
Oh, from me. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to ask, over the last 10 years, have there been significant changes in the type or quality of subsidized child care that people use, or in the quality of pre-care and Head Start programs? And, where this is going is, do you think your findings would be any different if it were possible for you to do the same analysis now with a sample of children currently, let's say, between the ages of 2 and 4?
That's a great question, and I would love, there are not, analogous data available on children, in 2016 who are in preschool as there were in children in 2006 who are in preschool. But my suspicion is that because there's been such a dramatic expansion of public pre-K programs across the country, that it's possible that some of the highest quality early care and education providers, so the teachers who used to work in community-based centers that serve children with subsidies, have been kind of creamed or siphoned off, and are now working as public pre-K teachers, because in general public pre-K programs provide higher salary and more benefits than community-based child care centers that serve children with subsidies. So because we've seen this dramatic expansion of pre-K in the last 10 years, if that expansion means that the highest quality community-based child care providers who used to teach children with subsidies have now jumped ship and are teaching children in public pre-K settings, it's possible that the quality of community-based child care centers has gone down relative to the quality of public pre-K, for instance. I think that's a really interesting question that we don't really have the data to answer right now, but I would love to get that answer, because I think the answer is probably yes. I think we'd probably see some differences, again, paying close attention to who's the comparison group. So relative to public pre-K, I bet that the quality of subsidized center-based care has gone down, and the quality of pre-K has either stayed the same or maybe gone up a little bit because of its kind of increased national attention and associated funding.
Thanks. That's interesting.
That's interesting. So a question from the audience. Lots of parents who've exhausted their time on aid for TANF still remain eligible for TANF but ineligible for subsidies via the county. They become a direct referral but often do not receive services as the TANF aided parents are prioritized. Any directives, initiatives toward addressing this gap of individuals?
Not that I know of. That's a real problem. Not that I know of. In most states and, in city, office departments of health and human services or whatever, the local subsidy administration offices, wherever it's housed, they do, as the question asker noted, prioritize TANF recipients for child care subsidy receipt, and then those transitioning off of TANF are also part of that priority population. But because most states run wait lists, many families who aren't TANF recipients or recent TANF recipients are on waiting lists and are unlikely to ever get a subsidy, unfortunately, because the supply is far inferior to the demand. So I don't have a good answer to that question, except to kind of acknowledge that the question asker has identified a real problem and something that I don't know what's being done to solve. Families who are eligible for subsidies are not receiving them because of these long wait lists, and the families who have transitioned off of TANF or exhausted their eligibility are among those probably on wait lists for subsidies who won't get them.
Important topic. I have two kind of related questions. During your research, did you find any correlation between parents using subsidies and their employment rates and or long-term employment? And is there an association with parents getting additional education?
So the first question is not something that I have investigated personally, but there is a much longer research tradition looking at associations between subsidy use and parental employment status than there is in my line of research, which is just looking at subsidies and children's developmental experiences and outcomes. So that other longer, longer history research area has found pretty consistently that subsidies do increase both the likelihood of being employed and then the length and stability of employment among mothers. And that's been true in some national studies as well as more local studies in Wisconsin and some work, I believe, done by MDRC in Illinois and on some of their multi-state subsidy and welfare studies, welfare demonstration program studies. And then the second question is interesting and something that I've actually kind of had in my back pocket as something I'd love to look into. I just haven't had the right data yet. But I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that that's a question ripe for the asking, whether subsidies allow parents to increase their education levels. So do subsidies allow moms to go back to school, and if so, to gain a higher level of education? My guess is yes, and someone probably has looked at that. I don't know the answer.
Okay. Well, here's another one. Has any of your research suggested whether attachment is affected by children whose families utilize child care subsidies? For example, many of the clients I serve must utilize child care quite early after giving birth, sometimes immediately following birth. It appears that parents of higher socioeconomic status are able to use maternity leave and child care much later.
So some states do require parents to return to work as a condition of welfare receipt as early as like 3 months after the birth of a child, and I'm sure that I know that there are mothers who return to work much sooner than that, either to keep their jobs or because they need a new job. There hasn't been any research linking child care subsidies to attachment outcomes per se, but there is a richer, more long-standing body of literature that was initiated in kind of the era of the 1980s, like the daycare wars, looking at associations between maternal employment more generally and child attachment. And I think that the conclusion of that body of research is that there really isn't an association between mother's employment and children's attachment kind of writ large, but that there is some moderation by how happy the mother is, whether she chooses to go back to work or needs to go back to work, and the quality of her employment, and then the quality of the alternative care arrangement. So the largest study, the kind of daycare study that exists is a study that sampled children born in 1991, so it's quite outdated at this point. And it's not a national study, but it is a multi-site study. And that study found that, I believe, children who went to daycare, or child care early when their parents went to work, assuming the quality of the care was moderate and good to very good, there was no effect of early maternal employment on children's attachment outcomes per se. There's a much larger body of research on associations between maternal employment and children's cognitive outcomes and social emotional outcomes, not attachment specifically, and that research does find some interesting variation by when in the first year of life mothers return to work, according to different kind of racial and ethnic subgroups. So that's a whole different series of webinars probably. That's a huge body of literature. So the short answer to the question is no. There's no association that we know of between subsidies and children's attachment, and there's very little association between mothers' early return to work and children's attachment.
Here's probably one you can answer quickly. If you use non-licensed facilities, if parents use non-licensed facilities, are the care providers mandated to participate in training or educational activities to increase their level of quality?
No.
I thought so. Here's a question for either of the speakers. could either of the speakers comment on pay-for-success models being used to finance child care services? These models, Utah, perhaps Virginia, are predicated on research demonstrating effectiveness of child care in higher academic performance, leading to cost savings. So either of you have comments on the pay-for-success models?
Gail, you may be more familiar with research in that area. Do you know?
Well, I am familiar with some pay-for-success programs. I'm not familiar with any in the child care area. That doesn't mean that they're not happening, but I don't know of any in that particular area.
I do not either.
So one other question is, what was used to determine child outcomes? How do you allow for the variance of multiple tools most likely being used by various programs and or states?
In measuring children's development?
Yes, I'm assuming this means the outcomes that you used in your analysis.
Okay, so my data set is a national data set collected by an initiative funded by the Federal Department of Education, and they used a kind of standardized set of research-validated instruments to measure children's early reading skills, their early math skills, and their behavioral outcomes. So these are not the kinds of tools necessarily that states use, like state departments of education, when they're trying to assess children's proficiency levels at grade, for instance. It's a different kind of set of measures that I probably don't have enough time to kind of go into detail what they are. But I think suffice it to say that they're kind of standardized, well-validated research tools for assessing those outcomes.
Okay, it's been common across states. Here is a related question, if you can answer it in 1 minute. You mentioned quality of care, and it was measured using the ECHRS. Could you briefly say what the ECHRS measures?
Sure. So the ECHRS is the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale, and there's a version for center-based settings and a version for home-based settings.
Hello? We seem to have lost you.
Hello?
Anna,
Yeah.
this is the operator. Can you hear us?
Yes?
You cut out there
Hello?
for a minute. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I don't know where you lost me, but the ECHRS is a 42-item checklist administered by a trained observer who goes into the child care setting and looks for the presence or absence of materials, activities, spatial features, curriculum items, interactions between the teachers and the children, et cetera, and kind of checks it off, and you get your 1 to 7 point score based on that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, and you managed to get it in. I want to thank both Anna and also Gail for joining us in this interesting discussion. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's conference. Thank you all for your participation.